everything is of its own self-containment. And I gave the example of you cannot bite your own teeth and you cannot see your own eyes, because a thing as an eye or a thing as a teeth has a purpose of biting, and it cannot bite itself, or the eye cannot see itself.
Bang! Hello. Hope you're having a good life so far. You're listening to Lofilosophy, the second episode. This episode is going to be on the philosophy of personal identity. Hope you enjoy. Let's get straight into it.
So, before we get into the nitty-gritty of what personal identity is, I'm going to have to define what personal identity is objectively before I do that. So, to me, personal identity is the idea of consciousness being aware of itself. And that's kind of hard to visualize, but it is essentially what it is. So, personal identity is the idea that a person is a thing and is real. I believe that personal identity is something very core to the human condition, and it's not very common among the animal kingdom. Like, for example, if you take like a rat or something, they don't have a personal identity, or maybe they do, and I'm just belittling a rat, but I very much doubt that they have a personal identity. I feel like they're just programmed by nature to do certain things, and then they die, but they have no kind of resentment towards anything, but they also don't have any positive feelings towards this. So now that we've established that the personal identity of a person is the idea that they are a thing, we can kind of deconstruct the different components of personal identity, because obviously I think that there are four main ones, but obviously there could be a load more of different ones depending on what person you are, which means that kind of personal identity is obviously a personal thing, but it's all subjective, and I don't believe that there's an objective personal identity, that being the human chooses their personal identity, and there's no set one for each person. They choose it. But also, it seems that we are at the mercy of our personal identity. For example, if you really liked skating, then you like skating, and that's kind of the end of it. Like, you like skating, so you're going to do skating more, and you kind of discover more about yourself rather than consciously creating what you enjoy. You more explore and unveil what your personal identity is throughout your life, rather than kind of engineering it from cog to cog and engineering all the intricacies of it. It's a more creative process and less of a mechanical one. It's kind of a wishy-washy, fluid unveiling of what you are and what you like, because I guess what you like is a big part of people's personal identities nowadays. But it's a weird one. Personal identity is taken very seriously, especially nowadays with all the different movements of people wanting to being accepted for their own personal identities. And that's with essentially every group of people, race, gender, preference, sexual preference, all of them. They all want to be accepted and acknowledged as being a person, rather than just being a part and a number in a group. So I'm going to go back to the four main points of personal identity that I feel like build up the entire structure. So the first one is our memories, right? So I'll give you an example. If you give an example of a baby doesn't have much personal identity, as they don't have much of a memory. I don't think babies understand that they are a thing. I can't ask a baby, so I don't know how we would determine. Actually, if you were a thing, you would have to communicate it in some way. And me being a thing as in me having a personal identity, I can recognize another thing being entity that also has a personal identity. And so I feel like babies don't, because I would recognize if they do. I think they develop one, but at the moment of their birth till like 5, they're kind of developing it more. And so the first aspect of the personal identity pyramid is memories, because they have no memories yet. They can't look back on anything and say, oh, I am defined by this, because essentially personal identity is a definition of what you are and what constitutes your being, and what your certain boundaries are. And so if you have no memories to base that off of, it's kind of difficult to build your personal identity shack and live in it. The second pillar of personal identity, I would say, is projections. So memories is the past version of thoughts, and projections are the future versions of thoughts. So for example, if you have a desire for something, if you want something, and that's not just like an animalistic want, as in like I want food, that's natural, that's due to a feeling. But projections as in like I want a new car, like that. So projections about the future is, I think, is essential, because we also base our identity on what we could have and our potential, as well as basing it off of what we have done and like. And we can kind of relate both of those things, and we can whittle them both down into what your preferences are. So maybe preferences is a better all-encompassing word for those two pillars right there, because a memory is just a snapshot in time that is taken by your brain. And how it relates to personal identity is we would put a certain emotion attached to the memory, which is another one, that's feelings. But the memory is the recalling of the actual event, and the feeling is the emotion attached to it. But the memory kind of constitutes what you like, and you can kind of attach a certain connotation onto your preference about the memory. For example, if you went roller skating and fell off and scraped your knee, you would say, I don't like roller skating, because you've related that negative connotation towards roller skating, and you define that as your being, as in you are not likely to go roller skating again, as you define yourself as a person that does not like roller skating, and therefore you wouldn't go. And it's the same with projection. So if you are that type of person, as in you are a roller skater, occupation comes into it a lot, and the activities that you enjoy doing in your free time as well. Essentially, that could be whittled down to your experience. Your personal identity could be what you enjoy doing, which is, I guess, where you go, which is your experience, I assume. So personal identity, those two pillars right there, memory and projections, can be reduced down to their cause, which is essentially just experience. But that's kind of all encompassing. Experience is essentially everything that we have, so that's kind of it's hard to paste that onto just two things. So the third pillar that I feel like is one of the most important things, especially for our human condition, is feelings. And as I was saying before, we relate feelings to a lot of things to help us understand the world around us. But feelings can also blind us. So feelings make up a lot of our personal identities. Like people would say, I'm an emotional person. That means my personal identity is I have a lot of emotions and I have a lot of feelings. Yeah, and that also comes down to preference as well. You can have positive feelings about a certain event, where other people may not have the same feelings about the same event. And that makes you unique, and there is a certain uniqueness to each human, regardless of all of our similarities, because there are a lot, to be honest, because I guess we're all the same species at the end of the day. But there are so many different subgroups of humans that have largely different perspectives and preferences and personal identities. And I think that is because of the first two pillars, which is memories and projections, because your memories and your experience, well, your experience creates your memories and your projections, because you're going to want more of the things you like that you can perceive, which is influenced by your experience. But you will also attach certain feelings to the things that you enjoy because of your experience. So all of these things, I mean, all three of those things could be whittled down to experience. But I feel like personal identity and your personal experience is essentially the same thing. So that means that all of these things make and kind of compile together to create your experience, your memories, your projections, your feelings, and thoughts. Thoughts is the last one, I just jumped into that. Thoughts, I feel like, is the fourth and final aspect of your personal identity and your experience. I can use them interchangeably now because we've established that they're essentially the same thing. But your thoughts, we kind of discredit the amount of thinking that we actually do. Personally, I think all the time, constantly, right? Either subconsciously or consciously, I'm always thinking. My brain is always churning something out, it's always grinding away. If I'm in an activity, if I'm not in an activity, it's always going. The only time where I don't experience thoughts is when I'm in deep sleep, and essentially there's nothing there. And that is the only time you get a break. Other than that, your thoughts are always going. But I do think that thoughts are the lowest form of energy expression because it really does not take a lot to think. Some thoughts take more than others. For example, if you're doing a hard math question, you actually experience the same chemicals as physical pain because you're kind of growing in a way, because you're kind of exercising your logical brain. And obviously if you're doing exercise, then it's going to be uncomfortable, but you get growing pains from expanding your mind and pushing your limits of your mind, especially when thinking. But most thoughts, like, oh, I wonder how he's doing today, do not take a lot of conscious effort, I might say. You could say that thoughts are automatic, and that is a prerequisite to the human condition, and you kind of have to have thoughts, because a human without thoughts is, could you say they're a human? I don't believe that you could say that they're a human. So that is a huge part of our personal identity, our collective personal identity, because I'm trying to find a broad range of the definition of personal identity that fits most human beings. So those are the four things that I feel like are the building blocks of personal identity: your memories, your projections, your feelings, and your thoughts. If there was another person here with me, I feel like they would input what they have experienced, but I think I could reduce whatever they said down to one of these main points. So now that we've established that the things that are at the innermost core of personal identity are memories, projections, feelings, and thoughts, we can move on to what influences people's identities and how that kind of affects their decisions in life. So your memories, projections, feelings, and thoughts are all made by your experience. They're all made by your experience, so that is what influences people's identity. Of course, I've said this in the last podcast, but go and watch that if you haven't watched it. It's a pretty good one. What you consume is what you become, and if you're consuming a certain type of content or a certain type of energy and a certain type of environment, you're going to become that. And because we are, as humans, quite adaptive, I've figured this out. I've not figured it out. I've observed this throughout humans because I like to study people and how they move and how they work. But we are, as a race, really quite malleable, which means that we're quite versatile and we're not limited to a certain one box of, we're not limited by our biological preconditions. So I'll give you an example. If you look at every goat, let's say you look at a white-tailed mountain goat, every white-tailed mountain goat does the same thing. They all climb mountains, eat grass, bump heads. They do goat stuff. They all do goat stuff, and it's very predictable what they do. However, with a human, their experience obviously shapes their personal identity, but they do have an element of randomness and an element of flexibility, and you can mold and shape a personality like you can't do with any other animal that I have encountered. You may be able to do it with dolphins and gorillas and stuff, like very high IQ animals that are quite close to our intelligence level, but that would just mean that intelligence relates to how flexible your personal identity is as a being. I want to go on a little side note. If our personal identity is only these things, and I say only, they are quite a large part of our life, but only as in the sense that we make our personal identities to be this huge, grandioso thing and our whole life, because it is our whole life experience, it is our entire experience. But if they can be reduced to these four things: memories, projections, feelings, and thoughts, then I want to know what the glue is that puts all of these components together, that holds the continuity of personal identity together. What I mean by this is, I feel like our personal identity is made up by our memories, projections, feelings, and thoughts, especially memories and projections, because we say, I am that, or I am going to be this. I am is a very powerful set of words, even though they're just sounds, arbitrary sounds that we've assigned meaning to. Because we've assigned meaning to them, they are very powerful. So due to the fact that our personal identity is just memories, projections, feelings, and thoughts, it's difficult to say where those four things intertwine to compile and make a person, a human, or a thing, a being, maybe a gorilla, maybe a dolphin, whatever. And that's what I want to know. I want to know how these relate to each other. But I guess it's all metaphysical, which means it's all intangible and you can't hold it and you can't examine it like you can with the science. It's all quite subjective. I want to say subjective, but I do try and make the most objective points that I can with what I have so that everyone can understand them if they're not looking through a certain lens of perception. I say the glue because I feel like, due to the fact that goats, for example, don't have these four things, they can't have a personal identity. But I wonder if these four things compiled together makes a personal identity, or if you could have 3 out of 4 and still have a personal identity. We could run all scenarios that would entail. We could run those 4 scenarios, taking 1 out of each. As in, we could take memories out of the equation and we could say, well, if a being just had projections, feelings, and thoughts, does it still have a personal identity? But we've already established that memories and projections and feelings and thoughts, they're all a part of your preference. And I don't know what preference actually is. So we might go into that now. So if memories, projections, feelings, and thoughts are all forms of a preference, then where does the preference arise from? So I'll give the example of music taste. Obviously, you could argue that your environment affects what music you like, of course, and the people you're around, yes, of course that they affect what music you like, but without influence, how would you determine and how would you define what your preference is? So what we've done so far in the podcast, we've defined what a personal identity is and we've broken it down and we've kind of built it back up into this all-encompassing word. So personal identity could mean memories, projections, feelings, and thoughts. However, they're all linked. So for example, if you had a bad memory, you have a bad feeling associated to it, and every time you think about that bad memory, you project that it's going to happen again so that you don't do that again. And that is just your preference, essentially. But what I can't figure out is how wide the range of preferences and why it is like that, and what affects your preference so that we can have this huge wide spectrum of preference throughout the human race. Because I don't think a ladybird's looking at a leaf and saying, oh, I don't like leaves, actually, I don't want to eat leaves. You can't, because you don't have a preference. So then we could argue, for personal identity, preference is the most important thing for a being to have, for personal identity to be a thing. But if your personal identity is what you are, if we identify ourselves with our personal identity, which is essentially what you're meant to do as a human, but you can choose not to do that. You could identify yourself as apparently now a dog, or whatever you want, but you could also identify yourself with like God and even like the universe and whatever you wanted to. Let's take the scenario that you solely base your identity on your character, your person's. For me, it would be the person that I'm in, the body that I'm in, this personal identity. If I identify with that, then I could be easily manipulated if someone knew my preference. Because if that's the sole thing that controls what you are, then someone could essentially control what I am with the knowledge of my preference and the implementation of my preferences in certain ways, so that I would have to choose a certain pathway because I have a preference. And it's difficult to get around that because, of course, we are our preferences. You say, I like this, and that kind of defines you. So practically, you could use this to maybe influence people. I don't think manipulate is the right word, because I doubt you could manipulate someone completely without them catching on and realizing that you're manipulating them by doing everything that their preferences told them to do, because we can go against our preferences. For example, if I really wanted to eat food but I was trying to lose weight, I could fast, and that is something against my preference, because obviously I would rather eat food if I wanted to lose weight. If I want to eat food, I'm going to eat food. That's a preference. Or we could say a better example is a preference about lettuce or chocolate. If I was trying to lose weight and I wanted to lose weight, I wouldn't eat the chocolate because that makes me gain weight. I would eat the lettuce. But that's against my preference. I prefer to eat chocolate because it tastes nicer. So maybe certain preferences weigh out over the others, because I would also prefer not to be fat. But it depends how bad you want something, and then the whole thing could be whittled down again and reduced again to desire rather than preference. Desire would be a more inclusive word for everything, because without desire, I don't think anything would happen. Because without the desire to eat, I don't think anyone's eating out of necessity, because eating tastes so nice to us. Nature has made it easy for us to survive, essentially, because we are so motivated and so energized to eat, because our desire is that we want to eat rather than not, because it tastes so nice, especially when you haven't eaten in a while. It's even evident in survival techniques. So for example, nature knows that you survive more with a greater amount of calories and a greater amount of energy. I say nature knows. The adaptation of the environment went in a direction that more calorically dense foods, which means more energy, is more beneficial to us, so that they taste nicer. And that's why chocolate tastes so nice, because it's got a lot of calories in it. But the society has hacked our brains to make us think that, to kind of manipulate the desire for the calorically dense food, and that is a way that they can genuinely manipulate you. Because of course, if you want to lose weight and you don't want to get diabetes, you wouldn't eat 10 chocolate donuts. But if you like chocolate donuts that much, then the suppliers putting them in your face is not helping you lose weight, or reduce your diabetes or whatever. That's an example of how our desires can defeat us in a way. But our desires are what makes us a whole, or are what makes us a thing. Without desire, I don't know what I would be, personally. And if you had no desire, you would have no ambition. I don't believe you would have any motivation, because what do you need? You don't need anything. Or maybe you don't need anything, but you don't want anything. So you could just do nothing and be fine, because there's nothing that you want. But essentially, that's just death. If you're just going to stay still for the rest of your life without desire, that's essentially just what dying is. You just stay still forever, and you're not sad and you're not happy, but you're just kind of there, and it's just not. There's no subjective connotations to anything, because you don't have a desire. You don't say, I want this, because desire breeds the opposite of desire. It goes back to preference. The positive aspect of preference is desire. However, the negative aspect of preference is the realization of what you don't want. And so without desire, there would be nothing that you don't want, or nothing that you would be against. And that would mean that you're kind of a free-flowing spirit. And so it's kind of a double-edged sword, because if you lost all of your desire, you would lose your personal identity, but you would gain essentially the energy of the universe and the flow of the universe, because you don't resist anything, because there's no desire, and you wouldn't be opposed to anything due to your personal identity, and you wouldn't be limited, because essentially personal identity is a box, and it's I put myself in this box, and I am this and I am that and I am not that, when in reality you define those things, and so you put that on yourself. Or we define those things, so we put that on ourselves, and that influences what we think we are. But the reality is, we may not know what we are. And I say that because that's kind of crazy to say. But for example, you can't look at your own eye, and you can't bite your own teeth. As in, a being of its own nature cannot perceive what it is not. A better way to describe that would be everything is of its own self-containment. And I gave the example of you cannot bite your own teeth and you cannot see your own eyes, because you can't. A thing as an eye or a thing as a teeth has a purpose of biting, and it cannot bite itself, or the eye cannot see itself. As in, you can see yourself in a mirror, obviously, if you're going to go that right, but that's not what I'm talking about. There needs to be an external thing for there to be an internal thing. And that's related to the duality rule of the universe. Each thing has an opposing thing to make it whole, because you get high, you get low. You see, you don't see. You bite, or you don't bite. You can't bite without there being something to bite, or you can't see without there being something to see, and they cause each other. And that's what the yin yang sign is. There is a white dot in the black half, and there is a black dot in the white half, and so you can't have one without the other. They are codependent on each other. And so I say that to say our personal identity is necessary for us to perceive that there is something other than a personal identity. So I'm going to move on to the purpose of personal identity. Why do we have a personal identity? Why is it environmentally, biologically advantageous for us to develop a personal identity? What is the point? And I think that without a personal identity, we wouldn't be able to perceive anything as truth. And this is why I say that. So I'll give you an example. What is the point of being happy if you don't know you're happy? There is essentially no reason to do that. Then again, the consciousness of being happy and knowing that you're happy is the pinnacle, the peak of life. But that comes with a cost. When you're sad, you know you're sad, and that is the cost. And so essentially all positive and negative emotions are exacerbated so that one knows what they are and how they are feeling, and they can define and confine themselves to that certain feeling or emotion.
Much gratitude is given to the people that stayed this long in the video. Thank you so much for listening to my podcast. I'll see you in the next one.